Hi, I'm Ed Hoffman, President of Competitive Business Solutions, and I'm here today to talk about the digitization of lean. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and it goes to my background. About half of my career has been in corporate America, and about half of my career as a consultant. And I have some of the highlights shown on the slide, but I'd like to just point out a couple of key elements of it and how it ties to the digitization of lean. First, early in my career, I had an opportunity to deploy SAP. We were the first full-up SAP deployment in A&D, and had the opportunity to see how that could help operations and hurt operations, depending on how you re-engineered the processes. In conjunction with that, I had the opportunity to implement lean in a space business for Lockheed Martin. And that was extremely challenging. Lean itself was somewhat not well defined, and we were doing it in a business that was non-recurring and not very traditional. And so we learned a lot through that process and had a lot of successes. On the heels of that, I switched careers and I started Competitive Business Solutions January of 2000 to continue that journey on implementing lean, as well as thinking about how to take some of the more advanced concepts like we did at Space and apply them to our clients and customer bases in traditional and non-traditional industries. And with that, I came up with the idea that the digitization of lean and how it integrates with Industry 4.0 might be of interest to talk about in this conference. And so with that, I'd like to hit a couple of key topics throughout today. First is, what are some of the key forces that's driving us to think about lean and how to integrate it with the digital world? And then what do we mean by the digitization of lean? What is it? What is a lean system? And when we say a business system, a lean business system, what do we mean by that? And so I talk about that in terms because it's important when we think about how do we integrate that with the digital domain. And then finally, what can companies do to prepare now and prepare in the future for this journey in the digitization of lean? So let's first start by talking about some of the key drivers. The first is around inventory. Inventory was one of those things that on the commercial side, it was always a heavy focus. In the defense side, it was often used as a buffer and a risk mitigator. But in the end, there's been some accounting rule changes that started to put pressure on inventory reduction, regardless of what industry you're in. And what I'm showing here on the right is a chart that's showing how this new accounting code, ASC 606, is affecting inventory costs. And fundamentally, what's happening is as you begin to put labor into your material, it's starting to show up against your inventory, against your unbilled and billed inventory. And it's growing at a faster rate than regular inventory, which is causing that additional pressure. The second main driver is on job rotation. What we're seeing in industry, of course, is not just a difficulty in hiring people, but people wanting to change jobs at a faster rate, both within the company and moving to different companies. And what I'm showing on the right is a chart, sort of numerically, this is taken from the labor statistics in the United States, as the average number of rotations that someone takes, average number of years or tenure that someone is actually on a job. And for those employees that are 25 to 34, they're on a job for less than 3 years before they move on with an employer. 35 to 44, you can see it's a little bit longer at about 5 years, 5.5 years. So you can see by this trend that the younger workforce is rotating more. They're looking for increased job opportunities, rotation, and therefore it puts additional stress on how to implement lean and lean systems and standards. And then finally, the third is on the supply chain. We're all experiencing a significant amount of instability in the supply chain. That was there pre-COVID, and it's certainly there now that we're living with COVID and working the material challenges. And what I'm showing on the right is a survey on different industries. The top is manufacturing. And the question is, what percent of your supply chain has been impacted? And over 60% of the companies state that their supply chain has been impacted by COVID and by the general supply chain disruption. So resiliency in the production process becomes critical. So fundamentally, the market forces, I like to kind of boil them down to come to three areas. There's the pressure on inventory, there's the challenging job market, and there's the supply chain instability. So I believe that we are in an inflection point. There's no quick change that we're going to see in these market forces. So the question becomes, what is our response? And our response has several different elements. One is around technology and how technology could be an enabler. The second is transparency, the ability to see throughout, for example, the supply chain and the entire value stream, both from a capacity standpoint and a throughput standpoint, what is capable when we're looking at satisfying customer demands and orders. And finally, being able to transform to a lean system, which will resolve many of these things, both from a standpoint of increasing capacity, improving efficiencies, improving deliverables to the customer. So before we go too far, I use this term lean system. So what do I mean by a lean system? A car is a great example of that. If you think about a car has a powertrain, which is essentially the engine, a braking system, and many other subsystems that make up the car. So from a lean system, the car represents how the auto moves. And just like a lean system, each one of these subsystems works together in harmony. If you were to take the braking system out, you would not be able to drive the car safely. So each one of these subsystems work in harmony to support the system. And in fact, a car you could think of as fitting inside of a larger system. Being able to drive from point A to point B, of course, you have the car, the main system, but then you also have something like driver safety. The driver who needs to navigate the car is actually supported by a number of other processes. Each state has training programs, students get licenses, and so on. That way, the person driving the car will operate it safely. There's an infrastructure, the road systems, navigation, refueling, how you support the car, both from a fuel standpoint and while you're driving. And of course, maintenance, the supportability of the car. So the car itself is a system, but then it lives inside a larger subsystem. And another concept I want to introduce here before we get into digitization is the concept around tools. Often you hear people talk about lean as, well, it's really a collection of tools. And when I talk about lean systems and business systems, we really talk about in terms of a broader network. Tools in this sense is really the items you use to fix and tune the system. In a car, the mechanic has got his wrenches and tools and he's working on the engine. And in lean, there's different tools we use to do the same thing, to get the lean system working in harmony. It could be, for example, standard work combination sheets, 7-cycle analysis, cycle time, takt time charts. There's a number of tools that your team has learned over time to tune the system. And so the question becomes is, why is this so important? Because when we think about digitizing lean, are we talking about tools or are we talking about systems? On the left, I'm reflecting what a typical lean system might look like. This was popularized by Toyota. Many companies use some variation of it, but essentially it's got the core elements of lean. It's got just-in-time manufacturing, it's got production leveling, and it's got Jidoka, And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about how bringing digitization to each one of those elements can work and how it's important. And on the right, we have lean tools. And I won't go through the details of them, but for those of us who do lean for a living, have used many of them. And of course, using digital and digitalization of this is, of course, helpful. But the question becomes, where do you start? And I'm going to talk about lean and the larger system, and then jump into the starting point. So just like a car, we have the lean system. It's the middle section that I illustrated on the previous page. And just like the car, we have a larger system that wraps around it. We have many companies use something called strategic goal deployment, might be also known as policy deployment or ocean planning, but it's a way of putting together the key transformative initiatives that's going to drive the strategic direction and improvement operationally. You have daily management. We'll talk a lot more in detail about daily management and the different elements of daily management, the operating rhythm of the business, monthly operating reviews, quarterly reviews, what is the sequence in operations, and of course, we have employee development. All four of these elements work in conjunction as part of a larger system. Now, I know you as a company, you have a different looking subsystem or lean system and a different looking larger system. And I'm not here to say that this is the right or specifically how it should look. What I am talking about is that the subsystem or the lean system and the greater system should be defined and understood by all levels of the management. And that really leads to the ability to define where to start from a digitizing of lean. So lean and the digitization of lean can start in the middle. It could start around the perimeter, but you as a business need to think through where to start and how to start. I'm going to go through some examples, and I'm going to start specifically around the beginning or the center of this. And I like to do that because I like to think about where value is created. Often when you start your lean journey, you start with inside the factory, you start with where value is created, where if you're in manufacturing, where the product is being made. And I'm going to go through and just show how JIT, which was this left pillar, is a good place to start from a digitization standpoint. A quick simulation that I'm illustrating here shows two different parts, this blue part and gray part, going through a typical flow in a factory. Like many factories in aerospace, most are not set up as 100% lean cells, U-shaped cells or straight cells. Most have some level of process centers. For those job shop or high mix, low volumes, there are majority of the shops are set up that way. And so what you could see is flow just doesn't exist. And the key drivers for that are the tools that we relied on in the past. Their MRP drives push production, business systems provide very little management. And in that chaotic view that I was just showing, where should you start? What do you focus in on? It's very difficult to see. So now we think about how a digital solution can help. Well, on the digital side, we could take that chaotic view and we can line up those processes. And we can line them up in a way that we can easily see the lanes that they're in. And when we do that, we have the ability to see the visual flow. We could see the factory steps in the sequence that they're done. We could create the priorities of what to work in what order in a way that's very different than what MRP and MES dispatch lists can do, MES being manufacturing execution systems. And now exception management becomes easy. Some of you have may notice that I have the parts loaded up here in different periods. And if I had the objective of delivering 5 parts a week, you can easily see that on, or 5 periods, excuse me, you can easily see on period 2, I do not have enough parts in flow. Whereas the previous illustration of the parts zigzagging through the shop, there's no clear visibility. In this way, by having this clear visibility, you can begin to create clear views of, is the line balanced? And therefore you have the opportunity for sort of a basic just-in-time concept around flow, tact, and pull. Once you're able to establish flow, looking at digitizing the constraints becomes the next most important element to achieve flow in JIT. And what I'm illustrating here is in this operation, turn A, multiple parts go through there. And by looking at that particular constraint and using all the information that you can compile against it, you're able to look at all the parts that go through it and determine which parts you would prioritize in order to level load downstream. In this illustration, where we talked about having 5 parts for period 1 and period 2, you could see that we're short 1 part for each period. So you would prioritize that. You wouldn't prioritize it based on which program's screaming the loudest. You wouldn't prioritize it based on an MRP algorithm for critical path ratios. You would prioritize it based on establishing flow. And by being able to do that, you can improve the overall output, as well as you could see, the point I'm making here is that OEE, which we'll talk a little bit about later, becomes very targeted. We'd look at OEE potentially for this turn operation, for example. So how does this all come together? What I'm showing here on the left side is the performance of inventory once you start establishing flow by using digitization throughout the value stream. This was a high mix, low volume shop. In that shop, it was a multi-level bill, about 6 levels deep in an aerospace product. And you could see the dramatic reduction in inventory level, as well as the number of parts. What I should also say is the output increased at the same time. And on the right is showing the speed or velocity of that particular shop, where we were touching parts every 70, 80 days, and that dropped down to every 30 days. So fundamentally, by implementing the digitization of JIT, we had a very strong impact both on the performance of the shop as well as the financials. And now let's talk about Jidoka. And there's really some core concepts of Jidoka, and I want to talk in terms of the ability to what digitization does and how we can bring that to bear. The first is around prevention. And what I'm illustrating here is there's software today produced by companies that allow you to dry cut or simulate cut parts before you actually do it. And in that way, you prevent the opportunity to crash a machine or create defects or cause other problems and interruptions in production. You could build in quality more easily. In the example here, I'm showing probing on a machine. And in the probing, it's not just verifying whether the part's correct, it's checking whether the fixture is squared before you cut. It might be reestablishing surfaces so you can eliminate something called offsets and manual intervention in machining, so you could create a perfect part every time. It also enables the continuous monitoring of production. Statistical process control and other techniques that have been widely used for many years has always been a problem to continuously monitor and integrate back into the manufacturing environment without intervention. And with digitization, and you add in a little bit of AI, you can do that quite seamlessly. And finally, proactive corrective measures. Measurements like OEE, that's always been very difficult to do, can now be automated. It could be easily color-coded. You can look at it as a function across quality and throughput much more easily and get a true OEE measure of how your factory is doing. There's other areas in digitization I think are important to talk about in creating a lean, agile solution. One is around additive manufacturing. That's been, of course, a big thrust for the last 10, 15 years. And as it relates to lean, there's certainly the opportunity for rapid prototyping, the ability to get a part into manufacturing and prototype it to find out what works well and what doesn't and how to simplify the process. The ability to do rapid tooling and 3P events in a fraction of the time that historically has been available. The ability to do much more rapid product development from start to finish and have an end product that is able to be delivered. Boeing has been doing that with 787, and so has many other companies. And then finally, the actual ability to create low volume production. And that low volume production through additive manufacturing really becomes a game changer and a huge enabler. We work with a number of aerospace companies that are growing rapidly because they're able to get very high reliability products to the market very quickly. Now I want to move on to digitizing the larger system. And when you think about digitizing the larger system, companies sometimes fall into sort of going after the obvious. I want to talk a little bit about daily management as that example. So what I'm showing on the left of here on the page is a typical daily management board in the work area. It's a visual board. It probably shows quality, delivery, and supplier performance, safety, all the key measures. It's probably pretty standard throughout the factory and through the company. And doing this data and charting it seems a little old school. So quite often, the first leap people will do is say, hey, why don't I digitize that? And they'll create these digital boards, they'll put them up monitors. They could be very, very effective. The question really becomes, did daily management improve because of the digitization? Was there some information that we were able to bring to bear that was important for the team to be able to identify problems, do better team problem solving, find the exception that was otherwise difficult? And as a manager, as a leader, when I walk around, I often think about what are those core principles of daily management and were those core principles maintained? And for me, and when I work with clients, the question becomes, what does daily management mean to you? And what are those core elements? And therefore, what are the things that we actually need to digitize? So I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about daily management and the opportunity to digitize it. So daily management is really no different than many other systems. It's a subsystem, daily management. It's more than a visual board. Tiered meetings, which I illustrated on the previous chart, is really more than just a visual board. It's about the ability to create accountabilities, tiered accountabilities. So when I see businesses going from a manual board to a digital board, questions to start asking your team are things like, is it improving the accountability of the team? Are they able to do better problem solving? Are the root causes more evident? And is the corrective actions able to be performed in a quicker way? Second element of daily management is leader standard work. I'm actually showing a paper copy here. This is a typical methodology that's used with Outlook. But of course, standard work can be, some portion of it can be automated. Checklists can come down through emails. There's other checklists that could be done through information boards and dispatch boards. And the question becomes, is the work actually being done? can you, with the leader standard work, actually monitor and improve the standard work, not just deploy it and hope that people follow it. So digitizing standard work can be a huge benefit, but could also put it into a black hole. Gemba walks. The reason I put Gemba walks here is COVID-19 has created a real challenge. A year and a half ago or so, with a number of clients, and I'm sure you experienced the same thing, you may walk the floor every day, every other day. You have standard processes that you use when you do visit the different areas of the shop and your support teams. And then COVID shut that down, and you had to go digital. Or some people went digital. Some used laptops or cameras on their phones to kind of walk and just have one person walk and everybody else see. The question becomes is there a place for digitization for Gemba walks? And I think that's something that the team needs to look at and challenge. I think seeing Gemba and being in Gemba is critical. You can get metrics, but there are opportunities to apply digitization to help both provide visibility to what's happening in manufacturing, as well as feel what's going on actually in the work environment. And those challenges, each of you I know have been working on, and it's a great place for best practice sharing within your own company, for those larger companies, and a place to identify what's been successful and what has not. And then finally, process reinforcement. So we're doing daily management. The question is how do we know we're doing it? How effective is that process? And can we improve on it? And that is a great place for digitization. We could bring in checklists on 5S, for example, where audit checklists are often manual. You can certainly digitize some of that as long as the people are still engaged. So process reinforcement is a great place. But in the end, you're trying to ensure that your daily management processes are creating the accountability, that you're getting clear exception management, and most importantly, that it's improving employee engagement. Now, just thinking about transitioning from all this digitization, let's talk about how to get started. So I like to think about the lean system and the business system that wraps around it. And so the first place to really get started is document the current state. Take an inventory of all the digital initiatives that are actually happening in the business. And I'm sure there's many. I've hit some of the topics. There could be some in preventive maintenance, for example, TPM. There's many other opportunities. And create that list. And then I would map that list, those initiatives, to the actual business system that I'm showing on the map. Yours, of course, will look different, but creating that picture and creating that linkage will be important for, I believe, you and the team to see what that connectivity is. The next thing to do is to evaluate the effectiveness. So we've all experienced implementing different types of digital solutions, some of which worked better than we anticipated, some not as well. And so the best way to evaluate it is to get a cross-functional team together. Nothing better to understand how well something is working than to have the customer of that solution in the room and evaluating along with the people that put it together. So establish a cross-functional team and do the evaluation. But when you do the evaluation, do it objectively, not subjectively. Create a list of those core principles. Example I used was daily management, and then score how well that digitization solution is working against those core principles. And finally, work on creating that future state. I would identify those high value areas of impact. You might find, for example, additive manufacturing could be a game changer in certain products, then certainly that's going to be a key focus. But by identifying those key areas and linking it to your lean system and your larger business system will provide clarity. And then finally, build a roadmap. Nothing is more helpful than building a living document of where you are and where you're going, and using that as a primary communication tool with the team. Getting everybody on the same page will flush out those things that are likely going to be successful, where the risk areas are, and the different things you can do to make sure that they're home runs. And finally, I'd like to wrap up with some final thoughts. One, I'm a big believer in understanding Lean from a system standpoint, understanding the larger business system and how Lean fits into it. And I think it's important to define all of that so that you can properly map the digital strategy to it. Second, although I didn't talk much about it, strategy goal deployment or strategic goal deployment, or whatever your company refers to it, is a key enabler to build that roadmap I just referred to. Key transformative initiatives that's going to cause your company to achieve its business objectives is critical to know. And then linking that to the digital roadmap or use it as a driver for the digital roadmap will serve you well. Third, digitization tools, although generally on the outset will have a big wow factor and people will feel very good about it, if it's not linked to the system, it will quickly have pitfalls. People will see that it's somehow not meaningful and somehow not meeting the objectives of the business. So I would just caution about leaping forward without having a good linkage put together. And then finally, this is an exciting time. There are tremendous transformations that are about to come. And I think digitization and Industry 4.0 is going to be helping us really lead the way and take that next big leap. And with that, I want to thank you. Once again, my name's Ed Hoffman, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation today.